This is my first YouTube video ever, like literally ever. I have not even posted a video as a child dancing to High School Musical song. This is huge, this is special, and thank you for being here if you are. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. If you don't know already, if you're not here from TikTok, I primarily post on TikTok about books that I'm reading that I like, that I want to recommend. And so I just figured move on to YouTube and do it in a longer format because I'm a Gemini, so I have a lot of things to say about everything all the time. I have read 46 books so far this year. Some have been great, some have been not so great, but I want to talk about the ones that I really love. This is the stack. I'll show you. Hold on. This is the stack, as you can see. It's not all of them because some of them were library books or some of them I don't have anymore. So I'm just gonna go through the list really quickly, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to go a little bit in depth. And for context, if you're not from TikTok, my name is Kristen. I read, review, recommend, rate books. I'm in my 20s. I live in New York City. And that's kind of all you need to know. I have a degree in history, so I have been a reader for, I don't know, for as long as I can remember. But lately I've been really interested in fiction because I'm no longer in school, so this is a great way for me to, you know, maintain my literacy now that I'm not studying anything. Just get right into it. This is in no particular order either. The first book I have here is The Way Spring Arrives. It's a series of short stories translated from Chinese for the first time. These are really beautiful sci-fi, fantasy, literary fiction stories. I think there's something for everyone in here, and that's why I rated it 5 stars. Some of these are translated by R.F. Kuang, who wrote The Poppy War. Oh, and there's also like literary essays, so essays on technique of translation. It is really fascinating. I highly recommend. Next, I have Peach Blossom Spring, which I will defend till the day I die. I feel like I never see people recommend it or say that they loved it, and I loved it so much. It's a multi-generational story about a Chinese family who immigrates from China to Taiwan and then to the US. What I love so much about it is how the history does not necessarily overshadow the fiction, so it doesn't overshadow the characters' journeys that they're on. And I know I did study history, but I think there's really an art form to getting your point across and getting the facts across while also creating a story that is unique and fun to follow and heartfelt, which all of this is. So I would highly recommend that one if you really like multi-generational stories like that. And I also have Ghost Town by Kevin Chen. This one actually comes out in October. Europa Edition sent me an early copy, and I loved it. I loved it. It's my most recent 5-star read. I'm gonna be honest, when you start to read it, it feels like you've just walked into a room where everybody is having a conversation and you have no idea what's going on. So if you get about halfway through, I think at that point you're like, okay, I can kind of get what's happening. And by the end of the book, you're fully immersed into the world. And when it ends, you're like, okay, now what? You go back and read the first chapter and everything makes so much more sense. Ghost Town is about a Taiwanese family, and the catalyst for the book is about the return of the youngest son, who in the English translation is named Keith. He returns to Taiwan after spending years in a German prison for not aliving his domestic partner. He's a gay man and he gets convicted of murdering his partner. So he returns to Taiwan during this time of year called the Ghost Festival. I think what made this book 5 stars for me was how all of the details came together in the end, and it made it so satisfying. Like I said, by the time I got to the end, I had to go back and read the first chapter. Next, I have another Europa Editions. This is called The Long Corner. This also came out recently. A lot of the books that I have here that are 5 stars are going to be recent because a lot of times publishers will send new books to me, and that's where I get a lot of my reading from. So The Long Corner, which I absolutely loved. It was the only book I read this year where I found myself like laughing at the dialogue, at the conversation, because I think a lot of times when books try to be funny, it can come across as very forced or very cringy, but this one I felt was very funny. It follows Saul. He is a corporate sellout, essentially, a writer turned corporate sellout who gets invited to this cultish artist retreat by this eccentric millionaire. Kind of asks you like, what is art? Who decides what art is and what is worthy of being called art? So I really loved it. If you liked White Lotus on HBO, I would definitely recommend this book for you. The next one I have here is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. You might have seen on HBO Station 11, which is also based on one of her books. These books are in the same world, so if you've read Station 11 and you read this, you'll see a lot of things that are familiar. I've never read Station 11, so I read this as a standalone book and I thought it was really good. I think what made it 5 stars for me was how accessible it was and how satisfying the ending was. It is about 3 different characters and different timelines, and they're all connected by this weird sound and this weird sight. Like it's very it's sort of difficult to explain, but once you get it, like it makes a lot of sense, and there's so many details that come together in the end, which is something that I clearly love in a book. I love when there's a lot of details that you get answers for. I really love this book. It's an accessible sci-fi read. Similar in the same family, I read The Poppy War. I have not read the other two yet, but The Poppy War, this is really the only fantasy book that I've read this year. It's an adult fantasy. I think what made The Poppy War so successful, in my opinion, was the way that Chinese history was integrated into this fantasy world. I really think that she is a brilliant writer and world builder, and I need to read the other two as soon as possible. I will say that it's an adult fantasy. There's a lot of content warnings, especially at the end. What I love about so much, even though it is very violent at the end, it's all very true to history. So she did not put anything in the book that did not happen in real life, and I think that's what gets you. Like, that's what gives you the chills. I also have here Leave the World Behind, which I just learned today is getting made into a movie. They're filming in Long Island. I think they were filming in May, but I don't know if they're still there. Leave the World Behind is about this family who lives in Brooklyn, and they decide to get away for the weekend, or for a week, I think. They rent a house in Long Island, you know, to quote, leave the world behind. And about halfway through their stay there, the owners of the house come back and they say, New York City is experiencing a blackout. We don't know what's happening. We think the world might be ending. So there's this sense of not knowing, uncertainty, frustration. If you go on Goodreads, it has kind of a low rating, but I think it's because it did not meet people's expectations of a traditional thriller or a traditional horror. But I think what made it so successful, and what I really love in a book, is when you can feel what the characters are hypothetically feeling. And it's a pretty easy read. I think I read this in like 1 or 2 sittings. Like, it really draws you in, and I can't wait to see how the movie turns out. Speaking of books I wish they would turn into movies, The Memory Police. I loved this book. I feel like if someone told me this was like written in the 1980s and they're now teaching it in school, I'd be like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It has a feel of like a new book that's going to be a classic one day. It talks about grief and loss and memory in such a beautiful and tragic way, and the imagery in this book is really makes it, and what I think it makes it so worthy of its own movie or adaptation. If you're looking for something sad but poetic and tragic, like, this is definitely that for you. I also have here Strange Weather in Tokyo. I don't think a lot of people have rated this 5 stars. I think maybe a lot of people forget about it because it's very subtle, very simple, but I think very sweet. And I think the connection and the way that she writes the chemistry between the 2 main characters is really beautiful. It's about 2 people who don't think that they're going to ever find love, and then they do, and they find each other. So I really love it. I think it's a great book. Next I have The Housekeeper and the Professor, which is also by Yoko Ogawa, the author of The Memory Police. And again, it deals in memory, grief, loss. In this book, it's done in a more uplifting or more comforting way. I would highly recommend this book. It's short, to the point, but really, really effective, and I loved it. The books that I don't have copies of that I really liked. The first book I read in 2022 was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and that was written in the 1960s, and I will say it holds up. The conversation and the dialogue is amazing, and it is so worth it. And you think, oh, you know, an older book, I'm not going to be able to empathize or relate to anything, but no. Like, it is, I think it's timeless. I think it really is one of those like timeless stories. I haven't read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and I haven't read The Lottery, which she's more famous for, I think. But The Haunting of Hill House, the way that she balances the absurd in terms of the comedy and the absurd in terms of horror, like, it's just such a beautiful blend between the 2 things. So I would highly recommend it, especially if you love spooky things. And I think, what else? Oh, I've rated all of Mieko Kawakami's English translated books 5 stars. So there's Heaven, there's All the Lovers in the Night, and there's Breasts and Eggs. All the Lovers in the Night is the newest book. I think if you're a fan of Eileen, you would like this book. The narrator is kind of pathetic, kind of sad, kind of hates her life. Then she just has an epiphany one day and she turns it around. It asks you, you know, if your life is imperfect, is it worth living? It is a really beautiful book. Kawakami has the same translators for all of her books, at least into English. Heaven is also really great. That one was the one that was up for the International Booker Prize this year. I'm not sure if it won, but I'm pretty sure it was shortlisted for it. It's about a boy who's relentlessly bullied, and he forges this relationship with his female classmate who's also bullied. And it talks about like agency and suffering, and are the weak really weak because they suffer. I would highly recommend that book. There were some parts that were violent and that were upsetting, so I would just take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, I loved it. And finally, Mieko Kawakami's Breasts and Eggs. I recognize that I give 5 stars to some books because they accomplish what they set out to accomplish, and they did it really well. This book is kind of the opposite. Like, I recognize in this book that it might be very long-winded, that it might be paced weird, that might not be super relatable for a lot of people, and I totally understand that. For me personally, the reason I give it 5 stars is because I felt it's on such a deep level. There were certain places where I felt like the author was just living inside my head and pulled out all of the thoughts that I have ever had. Like, just like such a powerful read. And I really highly recommend it. And while I do think this is my favorite book, I want to be upfront and like there are some criticisms that I have. The way that they talk about certain relationship norms, gender norms, sexuality, it's very heteronormative. Especially in the first book, there's a place where they talk about transgender people and their bodies, and in my opinion, it's just kind of unnecessary and it doesn't serve the story. So I'm like, why is it in there? So just be cautious of that going in, but I think otherwise I really love the book. Those are the books that I have rated 5 stars so far for the year. We're over halfway through for the year, and I have about 10, 11, 12 5-star reads. I really appreciate you watching this all the way through. That's awesome. If you have read any of these books and you have different thoughts, like definitely comment. If you have not read them, you go off and read them. Come back to this video and tell me what you thought. And also let me know your 5-star reads for the year, because even though these are all my books that I have on my TBR shelf, even though I have all these books here, you can never have enough. If you didn't come here from TikTok and you have one, you can go follow me there. That would be really cool. I post more consistently on TikTok for sure, just because it's easier and it's shorter format. So yeah, thank you all for watching.